Hello and welcome to another episode of ReConnect. I'm Kilian Engler, and joining me today is our field CTO, Brian Vecchi. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you, Kilian?
Very good. Thanks so much. Well, thanks for joining. We have a great episode for everybody today. We had our first Connect of the year, and we covered a lot of different topics in this one. It was really an update on where we are, where we're going, some of the recent events with SolarWinds, and a lot about Office 365. A lot of the biggest questions that we had from our customers coming out of last year and into this year and kind of looking forward. So we want to dive right into the questions because we've got so many good ones. Brian, are you ready to get into this?
I'll do the best I can.
Sounds good. Okay, cool. So I've broken these up into different sections because we covered a lot of areas and just trying to put some structure on it. So the first section is all going to be around SolarWinds and the supply chain type of attacks we've seen a lot of lately. Mm-hmm. So the first one we'll dive into is, what are some ways Varonis could have detected the SolarWinds breach?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. And I can say this without naming names. We actually did detect it in a few different places. So it's important to understand part of what Varonis is doing. We're not looking for very specific signatures of a breach like that leverages Sunburst or a particular breach, although we can look for things like in ransomware, file extensions or ransom notes or specific artifacts of a breach. But a big part of what we do is when we map and monitor the environment, first of all, we determine which accounts are human beings, which accounts are service accounts, which ones are admins and executives. And then we figure out what's normal for the accounts themselves, the systems that they touch, the data that they access, the devices that human beings use, and we pair those together.
Right.
So the easy way to think about how we can detect something like SolarWinds is that Varonis sees these SolarWinds service accounts. So what Sunburst does is it leverages, it basically the attack takes over a piece of the SolarWinds infrastructure using that hacked live update. And then the attacker has access to the SolarWinds device, the SolarWinds service accounts, and then starts using those accounts to start moving laterally around the network, maybe escalating privileges, getting access to data. Well, Varonis knows that those accounts exist. It knows what they have access to. It knows what they normally connect to. It knows what data they normally touch and at which times. So when those accounts start accessing systems and data that are abnormal for them, for each individual account, Varonis lights up and we say, hey, these accounts are behaving strangely. That's just one example. We could also see the DNS activity, the phoning home, the command and control that was done. We could also see potential data exfiltration, either over DNS or over through a web tunnel. There's lots of ways that we would pick up on abnormal activity. And a big part of that is Varonis is looking at the data. We're also looking at all the Active Directory authentication, the VPN, DNS, and web proxy activity too. And all that is combined together for our profiling. So there's lots of ways that we baseline what's normal and we know what's abnormal. And that's how we can connect. That's how we can identify misbehavior like this. It's also how we look for indications of compromise. So if you've got any SolarWinds infrastructure, I highly recommend, if you don't have Varonis deployed, that you let us do a risk assessment and we will immediately start looking for any indications that you were compromised.
Sure. That's great. Thank you. This is a follow-up question. I think this goes right to the last point there. Does Varonis offer any sort of investigation or remediation service that would help organizations determine if they've been impacted by something like SolarWinds?
Yeah, great question. So if you already have Varonis deployed, you have access to our incident response team. So there's a global team of experts that are run by Matt Radilek. They're the smartest guys in the room when it comes to incident response and forensic investigation. So they will get on the phone with you and they'll go through your environment. They'll look at the Varonis telemetry and alerting. They will expand into other systems and data if it makes sense. That's totally complimentary if you've got Varonis deployed. If you don't have Varonis deployed and you want our help, we'll do a risk assessment. And part of the risk assessment is we deploy the Varonis platform, and the IR guys are then available to you as well. So the answer is absolutely, and it's complimentary.
Awesome. And since we're on YouTube now, if anybody's a regular viewer, Ryan O'Boyle's on that team, so you might get lucky enough to hop on with Ryan and meet him too. So take us up on that for sure. So kind of another pivot on that. What are some recommendations for preventing or mitigating future SolarWinds type attacks?
Well, so that's a huge question. So the easy answer is make sure you've got defense in depth and that you're not relying just on perimeter controls and that you've got useful behavior analytics, that you're locking things down, that these things like your supply chain service accounts don't have access to data that they don't need. But SolarWinds is an example of the kinds of attacks that we see. Yaki, our CEO, he's got a great quote. The APTs of 2 years ago, the most advanced threats that we saw 2 years ago are today's script kiddies. Because all of those tools are now just kind of all the tools and techniques are just all off the shelf.
Right.
So you got to assume that these kinds of attacks and breaches are they're not the exception, they're the norm.
Right.
So you're going to assume that basic perimeter controls aren't going to protect you. When you make that assumption, it means that you start putting you take defense depth much more seriously. You don't just protect the endpoints and the perimeter. You actually protect the assets that you're trying to protect, the data in this case.
Cool. No, that was great. Thank you. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Office 365 has been a big topic for a lot of our customers, of course, with everything in 2020, and looks like we're into 2021 now with not much change. And a lot of people have adopted it and are continuing to adopt it and expand that usage. So we have a lot of questions around the functionality there. So let's dive into those. The biggest one I think we get a lot of times is, does Varonis compete with any of the native Microsoft functionality?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And we're a Microsoft partner. We're a silver partner. Varonis is actually available on the Azure App Store. We are not trying to replicate any of the functionality that they give you in whichever of the, I think, 14 different security portals that you have access to, depending on your level of Microsoft licensing. So there's a lot of challenges using Microsoft's tools, although they give you a lot of really good functionality.
Yeah.
That said, Varonis has a fundamentally different approach. In the specific kind of data that we're gathering, we're looking at and we're going to get into this when we start talking about shared links, but we're looking at the permissions of every single file in OneDrive and SharePoint, every single folder, every site collection, everything in 365 is a SharePoint site. Every SharePoint site's a SharePoint site, every OneDrive is a SharePoint site, every Teams site's a SharePoint site, every private channel is a SharePoint site. Planner's built on SharePoint now too. I think Yammer is. So everything is SharePoint and OneDrive, which means everything is SharePoint. What we're doing is we're combining the SharePoint permissions and groups with the Azure Active Directory group memberships. We're combining all of that together for every file and site collection. It's a really long-winded way of saying we have a fundamentally different approach. We also gather activity in a different way. We use the same APIs, of course, that Microsoft does, but we don't just make copies of the logs. So we're taking a fundamentally different approach. And the reason that we do, and the reason that Varonis is so useful, is that no matter what security functionality that you're using from Microsoft, you're going to end up with gaps. You're going to end up not really knowing where you're at risk. You're going to struggle to reduce that risk and reduce the likelihood that something goes wrong. And you may struggle with threat detection and especially threat response, the investigation time. So Varonis will reduce your time to detection and reduce your time to response. So that is a very long answer to no, we're not trying to compete with Microsoft, not trying to build a better wrench. What we are doing is providing you with the ability to close some of the gaps that are going to be apparent with even just a little bit of data in 365, as you'll see if you're using it at all.
Makes total sense. Thanks, Brian. We're gonna pivot to this, and you touched on it just a little bit in your previous answer. We talk a lot about the different types of sharing links. So to help the audience understand, what are the differences between public and external and organizational links?
Okay. So if you've used 365 at all, whether it's just OneDrive or you use SharePoint or you use Teams or you use any of these mobile apps, you may have seen the share button. So the idea is Microsoft makes it easy. The goal is frictionless collaboration. They make it easy to share with anybody who might need it. They give you a few different ways to do it. So you can create a public link, which is a link that anybody on the internet can click that link and access the file or the folder that it is linking to. Lots of enterprises turn that off. We do too, because it can represent a risk. You can also create individual links. You can create links to individuals inside the organization or guests or external users. So those links, what they are SharePoint groups that contain individual users or guests and external users, which exist. A guest is just a guest user. An external user is a user that is registered or authenticated to your Azure Active Directory. So that is a link to a specific set of people, and you can continue to add, or if you want to remove, although that gets really tricky, you have to do it from the SharePoint permissions view, remove people from that link. So those are individual links. By the way, those links can also contain other groups. You can add an Exchange distribution list or an existing AD group. So your permissions this is all for an individual file. It can get really, really complicated. So then there are what we call organizational links. The idea here is, and if you've ever shared something with 365, you may have seen this, you can, one of the link types that you can create is you can create a link that anybody in the organization can use. What this does is it creates another new SharePoint group, and it puts people into that group that have clicked that link. So what that link does, that link, when you click on it, adds your account into the group that has access to the resource that is being linked to. Functionally, what that means is if you've got a file or a folder that has one of those links that's been created, anybody who has that link can get access to that file or folder, which means if I create a link that anybody in Varonis can use, and then I send that link to you, Kilian, and then you send it on to somebody else, I have no idea who else is getting it. They can forward it on to other people. Anybody who clicks on it can use that link. And typically it's anybody inside the organization. So it's the equivalent of a global access group that anybody can use.
That's pretty scary stuff, and we know all about those. So that's it's interesting that this concept that's been around since forever has now come into the new age. So, well,
yeah, but it's easy to see why. Right? One of the things that people need to keep in mind is, so if you've used 365 a lot, like as you and I both have, we use it all the time. You can get into a situation where I need to share a document with you, but I know that this is a document that other people are going to work on, that are going to need it. And if I share it directly with you, you can't then pass that on to somebody else. They get an access denied if they try to use it. So I might just create a link. It's like, I know this is going to get passed to a bunch of people. I don't want to deal with the headache, or I don't want to deal with the issue of people need access to it, and we have to figure out, wait, who has it, who doesn't, who has the right link or not. I'm just going to create a link that anybody can use, which makes the collaboration more frictionless. It makes it easier for you to collaborate, but it ends up being a risk at the same time. So it's really useful. And we use it, again, I use it, I wouldn't say all the time. I'm pretty careful about when I create those links, but it does end up with potential exposure. Yeah,
for sure. And, considering if there's something sensitive out there that, it wasn't intended, it's just a really easy way to kind of spiral out of control. And yeah, I'm guilty of using it too. I definitely have done that, but, we got to pick and choose. So now we'll flip it around just a little bit. Does Varonis have any best practice recommendations for settings in Azure that can assist with locking down things like access or sharing settings?
We absolutely do. And I think, and I'm pretty sure, in fact, I know because I checked before we started, we've got a video course, like a training course that you can go watch that'll go through that. So if you'd like some kind of basic guidance on sharing settings or how to do an audit or kind of best practices of what you should set to, if you Google like Varonis 365 or Varonis sharing settings, that's near the top of the list. It'll pop up there.
Awesome. And we can put a link down there too, so people can find it.
That's a good idea too.
Cool.
Yeah, it's called 1 Hour Office 365 Sharing Security Audit, presented by Microsoft certified trainer.
Oh, excellent. Very good.
And you get a CPE credit for watching it too.
Even better.
That's great. Even better.
I should watch that and get a CPE credit. Cool. Okay, so here's about some of the risk reduction. Would disabling external sharing reduce or eliminate the risk in Office 365?
You can certainly argue that it would reduce the risk.
Sure.
However, so a few points here. If you do that, your users will find a way around it. By one measure, you are reducing the risk.
Right.
However, you may increase risk in another way. So be really careful about putting restrictions on users with collaboration functionality like this. The more you restrict, the more they find a way around it, right? So if you restrict their ability to share with external users in 365, does that make it more or less likely they're going to use their personal Gmail account to email somebody data, right? So you might increase risk in that they're going to find ways around it that you don't have the proper controls in place. But sure, you do potentially reduce the ability for users to expose data through that method.
Right.
However, it absolutely does not eliminate any risk.
Right.
First of all, because users will find a way around it. Second of all, because that doesn't address at all the issue of people inside the organization having access to data that they're not supposed to. So there's insider threat. There's also one of the most common attack vectors is to try to hijack 365 credentials, which then you can use to get access to data on-prem, right? So if somebody's credentials get hijacked by an external attacker, they don't need an external link to get access to data. They can just use the internal credentials. So by one measure, it may reduce the risk somewhat. It absolutely doesn't solve any problem whatsoever with risk. And I've certainly been in meetings with customers who were supremely confident that they had no 365 issues because they had disabled external sharing, and two things were apparent. One, they had data in places they didn't expect that was sensitive and open to people inside the organization they didn't realize. And two, their users were absolutely finding ways around it. So be careful with that. The better option is to leverage the collaboration functionality
Right.
that you have, but make sure you've got the right controls and monitoring in place to know if something goes wrong.
Yeah, makes sense. We've touched on both of these next two questions already in some of the previous answers, so I'm going to combine them together and just summarize them quickly again. First off, first part is, why are organizational links such a big issue? And the second one is, can you block documents from being shared internally?
So the first one, organizational links are a big issue because they can expose data to people who may not need to see it,
right.
which is simply a security and a governance and a data protection challenge.
Right.
It's something that you want to solve for. It doesn't mean that you disable the ability, but it should be something that you know about and can control.
Right.
Can you answer the question right now? How many files that contain sensitive information are currently accessible by anybody in the organization that has the link? If you don't know the answer to that, there might be some risk that's there that you don't know about.
Right.
It's kind of, just because you don't know that the risk is there doesn't mean that the risk isn't there. The second question is, can you disable all sharing? Well, sure. You can also just unplug the NAS. Just don't give your users any data, any access to anything. They're going to find a way around it, right? People need to collaborate, especially today.
Right.
We're now in a work from anywhere world. I don't even want to call it work from home. Like, people are starting to move around a little bit more. But we're expected now to be able to access anything from any device at any time and share it with anybody who might need it. That's the model that we're in right now. And that's not going away. So the more restrictions you put in place, the more users are going to find their ways around it. Especially if you use 365 and you disable all sharing, it's like, what are we even here for? Like, what are you doing?
Right.
The goal is that users can collaborate effectively, but that you can do so in a secure way.
Makes total sense. I'm going to change that up a little bit, move on to the next category of questions that we got from our viewers of the Connect event. This is all around data discovery and data classification. So we have a couple really good ones here. The first one that we get this pretty often, I think, too, is, how does Varonis determine what is sensitive data within our solution, of course?
Yeah, so that's a great question to start with, because when we talk about sensitive data, I've been mentioning it a lot.
Yeah.
How does Varonis know? Do you have to look at every single file and make a determination about whether this is sensitive or not? And the answer is no. So we have a piece of our platform called the classification engine. And what it does is it looks into the contents of every single file, and it looks for terms and patterns. So to look for, a set of numbers that looks like a social security number or a credit card number, what have you. It also look for terms like SSN and social and name and email address. It'll look for, we ship with dictionaries of medical terms, for instance, if it's looking for health information. And one of the cool things that our classification engine does, is it combines all these things together. Right. So if it's looking for data that might be related to PCI, which is payment card industry data, for instance, it'll look for something that looks like a credit card number. It'll run it through it'll run that number that it finds through an algorithm to verify, yep, this is really a credit card and not just 16 digits. Then it will look for, say, Visa, Amex, or MasterCard, for example, nearby, like within 15 characters. Right. So if you find something that is absolutely a credit card number and is next to the word Amex, it's highly likely that this document is related to PCI. So we've got the number of patterns and rules doesn't really matter that much, because you can have tons and tons of very simple patterns that are useless versus a smaller number of patterns that have a lot of logic built in that are really accurate and useful. But we've got patterns we've got these policies which contain the terms and the patterns and the algorithms all put together that will look for really common types of sensitive information. Right. PII, PII related to European citizens. We've got all these different GDPR patterns that'll look for, GDPR information of an Austrian citizen versus a UK citizen versus, a Spanish citizen. And it'll do things like determine the difference between a Hungarian license plate number and a Spanish, value-added tax number, things like that. We'll also look for California consumer information for CCPA-related data. We'll look for PHI. We'll look specifically for HIPAA-related data. We'll look for, and these are just some examples. All of these policies, and I think you might have a question about this coming up, you can also be customized to look for more proprietary information like intellectual property and project names, things like that.
Yep. Well, you hit it right on the head. That was the very next question I was going to ask. Is there a way for organizations to customize or create their own rules? And of course, the answer is yes.
Yeah. So you can customize, you can create your own. There's a lot of there's a lot of work that's baked into the policies that we ship with.
Right.
Because we have a classification research team that does things like they will look at new and existing regulations and see how they change. They will they will go get example data sets from existing customers. They will build the policies to look for that kind of data. Then they will test them with a smaller set of customers, iterate on them, make sure that they're accurate, and then deploy them to our entire customer base. Another huge benefit of our classification engine that I forgot to mention is that, first of all, it's hybrid. So the same engine is used on all of the data platforms that we support for classification, which is Windows and CIFS-based NAS, Unix and NFS-based NAS, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive. So you're looking on-prem and in the cloud. Yeah. One policy, you can look everywhere. The other big benefit that our classification engine has is that it can leverage our audit record. So Varonis knows when a file has been created or changed. So we don't need to scan everything all the time. We just scan the new files or the ones that have been changed to see if anything sensitive shows up. We can also prioritize our scanning. Like you can imagine a file that's got 100,000 or a file that's got a lot of sensitive data that's open to everybody versus a file that's open to 2 people. One's more risky. So we could actually use permissions for prioritization. And then, so the answer I started out with the answer to that question. The answer is absolutely you can customize things. You can also build your own dictionaries. There's a lot of flexibility into either cloning and modifying the rules that we ship with or creating your own.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I think that'll really help. This is kind of moving.
Actually, so I'm sorry. I want one more thing I remembered. Because we touched on this as part of, we're also doing things like you can take outputs from existing databases and then use those as string matches. So there's lots of things that we can do to look for proprietary information. So didn't mean to interrupt you there. But
no,
also, this is the kind of thing, if you're not using our classification engine and you want to see what we're talking about, this is part of what we do during the risk assessment is spin this up and start looking inside your files. So.
Makes sense. The follow-on question to this sort of is, can organizations get value out of the Varonis platform and data classification engine if they're not yet using sensitivity labels, so actual labels on the documents? And can Varonis provide insight that may help them in creating a labeling strategy if they're moving in that direction?
Whoever wrote this question really spent some time. So the answer is 100%. So one of the things I didn't mention just there is that, so our classification engine is automatic. It doesn't matter if there's a label on the file or not. What we are doing is we're looking into the contents of the file, figuring out whether it's sensitive or not. What we can then do is, if you want to, apply a label to that file. So let's say you're using Microsoft Information Protection, and you've got a classification schema, a very simple one. You've got public, non-public, top secret, and different kinds of data need those specific labels applied. The reason that you would put a label on a file, by the way, if you're not familiar with this, is that once there's this metadata tag on the file, that file has some persistent security. You can have other controls in place, like you can use Microsoft DLP to make sure that file is encrypted, or you can block it from being emailed, right? Because regardless of the contents of the file, if there's a perimeter control that sees, hey, this file has a label applied and it says top secret, I don't care that you're not supposed to email this. So Varonis can automatically apply those labels, and we do that in conjunction with Microsoft Information Protection. We actually use the MIP SDK to apply those files. We can also, if you've already started applying files, because our labels to files, one of the ways that you do that is you have your end users say, hey, I just created this document. I know that there's sensitive data here. I want to apply it. That's a really noisy and sometimes inaccurate process. There ends up being, you end up with a lot of false negatives, a lot of data that doesn't get labeled that way, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful. Varonis can read the existing labels. So we can say, hey, this file, not only do we think it has sensitive data in it, it's also got this label applied. So we know whether the file has a label applied or not. And then you can do a couple things. One, Varonis will tell you all the files that are sensitive that do not have a label applied, which is really useful information.
That's huge, yeah.
Two, we can also apply or have the wrong label applied. That's even worse, right? You can imagine somebody. So here's an example. We did a risk assessment, and labeling was a part of this. And we found a file during the risk assessment that was marked as public. But there was a ton of PII in it. And what had happened was, it was a spreadsheet. Someone had pivoted out of a database. And part of that pivot, part of the data collection from the database and dumping it down to the Excel file, had taken a dump of customer records. Now, the user didn't realize that that was what was happening, that all those customer records were being copied into the file because they were just worried about the analysis and the charts. So they marked the file as public because it was supposed to be public data, not realizing, hey, there's a ton of customer data here. So in this case, we identified that the file contained sensitive information, but was mislabeled. And what we can then do is apply the correct label or overwrite the label that's there. So you can either apply additional label or overwrite the ones. So all of that is saying, to answer there was a couple of questions that were actually asked in the one that you asked. So one, we don't require labels to be there. Two, we can certainly be part of your labeling strategy, and we will make labels more accurate and more effective because we'll make sure that they are accurately applied everywhere.
You answered my follow-up question to this already is how does Varonis work or enhance Microsoft Information Protection? It's all of the things you just said. The last one.
If you're using MIP, we're a huge value add. So I highly recommend that you talk to us.
Absolutely. Now, this one comes up a lot for our labeling customers as well, too. If you've added additional controls like encryption using Microsoft Information Protection, can Varonis still scan those files?
Yeah. So you give the service accounts that we are using or the accounts that have access to the APIs. In 365, I think the APIs just give us access. But on-prem, basically, you give us the service accounts access to the decryption keys. Basically, you're putting them in the AD groups that have access, and then we can scan the files. So as far as I know, there's no issue with that.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a big question that comes up a lot and just is worth clarifying for our audience. So moving on to the next topic, this is all about threat detection and response. So this one's a pretty interesting one, and I think we get this asked probably a lot, and this is maybe a Matt and Ryan field this question day in and day out. What's the average time to value after Varonis is deployed for threat detection and response?
Well, here's the way I like to think about it. Before you deploy Varonis, do you have any idea where you're at risk or any plan to fix it? No. Before you deploy Varonis, are you monitoring any of this data, or would you know when something goes wrong? No. So when you deploy Varonis, literally on the first day, you have way more information than you had before. And even before you start making changes, you are monitoring data in a way that you weren't before. And it's easy for me to say that we lower time to detection, lower time to response, and that Varonis is going to give you a small number of high fidelity alerts. Our incident response team will prove that to you. So just by turning us on, you are in a much better position from a security, data protection, and compliance standpoint than you were the day before. So the answer is I know it sounds, it's easy to say you have immediate time to value. You will get more value out of the Varonis platform the longer you have it in place and the more of our operational plan you go through. But even if you do nothing else, you now know when somebody starts accessing sensitive data that they've never looked at before using somebody else's device coming from a new location, for example.
There you go.
And it's that kind of thing is impossible to catch otherwise.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And that's all right out of the box, too. And it's worth noting that because the question we often get is, can you create custom detections or modify existing AI or the built-in detection logic for an organization?
So let's take that in two parts of that question. Can you create custom detections? The answer is yes. So you can basically alert on any individual event that Varonis sees. A really good example here is you want an alert anytime someone modifies the domain admins group, or you want an alert when somebody accesses or changes the permissions in a highly sensitive location, or you set up a honeypot sample sensitive data that might catch an external attacker or an insider threat. So the answer is yes, you can create your own custom detections. You can also create detections based on a threshold of events. Someone tries to delete 1,000 files or not. For the AI, for the machine learning based behavioral detections, no, you don't have the ability to tweak those because those are designed not to require you to do a lot of work. Any of the tools that require you to do any kind of building of your own threat models, for lack of a better word, where you're building your own patterns, I guarantee you it's going to be time consuming, expensive, and noisy. It's going to take a whole lot of time. It's the expertise that you have to pay to build those and do it well isn't cheap. And you're going to end up with noise, especially as you're tweaking them. One of our goals is that you don't have to go through that process. So our machine learning is based not just on a single behavior stream. This goes into the fact that every single event that we collect, we process and then enrich with additional information. For instance, when we collect a file access event, Brian is touching this file,
Right.
in this SharePoint Online location. We don't just take the raw event. We actually add the fact that Brian is an executive, that
Right.
Brian, that this file contains PII, that we use, that he's using this device, and he's coming from this location. So we add additional information to each event, and that's what makes our machine learning so effective.
Yeah.
The long and short of it is you don't have to do this work.
Right.
We build it automatically, and for most of our customers, there's not a lot of tweaking that needs to be done.
Right.
But the IR team, Matt and Ryan, their guys will get on the phone, and after the threat models have baked in a little bit, a couple of weeks, they will make sure that everything is working appropriately, that you know how to use it, and that there is no, I don't even want to call it noise.
Right.
Sometimes we see a situation, for instance, where you've got an application that's writing to a file system totally by design, but our AI will see it as, hey, there's ransomware here because this application is doing lots of opens and reads and modifies, and we just have to say, okay, for this particular account in this particular location, don't trigger this particular threat model, and they'll go through that process with you.
No, that's perfect. Another question that we get from our customers is this solution suitable for a small company with limited IT resources?
Absolutely. I mean, part of the whole idea here is that we automatically, when you deploy it, we automatically discover privileged accounts. We automatically classify sensitive data. All the baselining and risk prioritization, that happens automatically. Once we're baked in, we'll help you to configure the dashboards, configure any reporting, make sure alerts are working properly, then everything is just going to set it and forget it. The remediation, that happens automatically. You can automatically lock down all the exposed sensitive data. Quarantining, retention, and disposition, once that's configured, that's all automatic. So if we all have to do more with less. A big part of the value of the platform is that it does not require a big team to use and get value out of. So absolutely, if you're a small team, you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a lot of time, you are going to get a huge benefit of having Varonis in place, because we're going to make the stuff that you're doing right now way more efficient, and we're going to help you do the things that you couldn't do otherwise, but you're not going to have to spend a lot of time doing it.
That's perfect. This is next question is going to get a little bit more into the weeds here, but I think it's a really, really good one. How does Varonis detect threats in a split tunnel VPN scenario where the traffic from endpoints isn't going back to their on-prem resources, but instead going right to Office 365?
The answer is going to be simpler than the question was. It's a really smart question, but Varonis we're not on the endpoint, so we don't care. And in fact, almost everybody these days is going to split tunnel from their endpoint, because you don't want to backhaul the 365 traffic to your VPN, for instance. So we monitor at the data source. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the data on-prem. We're going to be looking at the perimeter. That's all going to be going to the Varonis infrastructure. We're going to have a collector in Azure looking at the 365 stuff. We'll see the VPN activity from the endpoint, but we're not deployed on the endpoint. So maybe I lied that the answer was a little longer than the question, but that's we do that internally here at Varonis. So everybody's doing that. Everybody's split tunneling, and it doesn't affect us.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a really good one when I read it too. Of course, we're getting the VPN information, we're getting the data information. Doesn't matter which one you're going to, because we're there, which is the cool part.
We're where the data is.
Right. No, that's very cool, and I really like that question. These next two are sort of related, and this comes up fairly often. Does Varonis have SOAR capabilities?
It's a really, really good question.
Yeah.
So the short answer is we can be used as kind of a SOAR light.
Sure.
So I've talked about all this alerting that we do. All of our alerts, whether it's an alert that you configure or one of our behavioral alerts, they can be set up to automatically respond. And typically that's done through a PowerShell script. You have other options, but let's say it's a PowerShell script. And since it's PowerShell, it can do anything that Windows can do in your environment.
Right.
That's most often used for highly severe events.
Right.
A human being has been taken over by an account is behaving like a piece of ransomware. Because you want to shut that down to limit the scope, limit the damage, limit the scope of the attack. So in this case, very simply, the script that you might use would disable the user account. It would also scramble the Kerberos token, so that account, if it's already authenticated somewhere, can't continue to access data. It might also disable the NIC on the device that's being used to prevent that device from doing anything else under another account. That's one example. Typically, you're not doing this for a large number of alerts, but you certainly could. It's also, so that's the short answer. Another way to think about this is we are not a security orchestration product.
Right.
And typically, if you have more advanced orchestration use cases, SOAR use cases, you would be using a SOAR product and Varonis would feed into that, or alerts would feed in for the orchestration. If you're not using one, you can use Varonis as kind of a SOAR-like.
Right. Makes sense. And if anybody wants to see that type of a ransomware activity and response in action, we have another video on our YouTube. I'll link to it. One of our customers actually did it, and he was nice enough to put it together. And this was part of the evaluation of Varonis. He set this up and actually built the ransomware himself. It's real ransomware that he wrote, but it's a custom one, so it's not a common detection. And as part of the demonstration, he actually triggered it in a closed environment, and we detected and shut him down. So it's a really cool demonstration. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely for the audience worth a watch.
And also, one of our attack scenarios that the IR guys will do involves, I'm not sure if I know the version that I've done. Sometimes in the end, we use the Maze ransomware as part of kind of the last step in the kill chain. We trigger this ransomware, and then we have the environment that we run it in set up to disable that account. And you can see it happen. Right. So you can see it from the user's endpoint where the ransomware is running, and suddenly they're immediately logged out. And then we go back and show that the alert triggered and logged them out. Yeah, that's cool. So definitely, we'll put links to those in for the video and for the. I think we have replays, and I think we do those live attack labs a couple times a week too, if you want to watch it live. Last question in this section: can Varonis integrate with a SIEM, and would this complement Microsoft Sentinel? The answer is the same to both. So Microsoft Sentinel, if you're not familiar with it, is Microsoft SIEM, cloud-based SIEM. The answer is yes. So typically, I always want to start this answer with Varonis is not a SIEM. Right. So we've talked a lot about logging, AD logging, perimeter logging, VPN, DNS, proxy, all the data access logging. So Varonis is either gathering and processing or creating that telemetry if it doesn't exist already, but we're not a SIEM. You can't throw your network logs at us. You can't throw application or endpoint logs at us and then have us analyze them. That's what your SIEMs are for. Right. SIEMs are inherently difficult to use as a predictive tool or a threat detection tool. But they're really good for aggregating lots of different log sources or kind of other telemetry sources. The way we integrate with the SIEM, and we can do this with Sentinel or any others, is the alerts that Varonis generates get sent to the SIEM. Benefit then becomes Varonis is the expert system on the behaviors that we monitor, data access events, AD telemetry on-prem and in Azure, VPN, DNS, and proxy. And by the way, for DNS, it's both internal and external DNS. So you can use us to detect things like recon and command and control and also exfiltration. So you use Varonis as the expert system, and then you send those alerts. So instead of, count up the number of DNS events that you have just in your environment this week. It's probably in the tens or hundreds of millions. Varonis does all that analysis, and then we send the handful of alerts. And then the alert in the SIEM, you can either call back to Varonis for an investigation or run an investigation inside your SIEM, and you just have like the one alert that tells you something weird is happening. Correlate that to other associated behaviors from that IP or that application or what have you. Cool. Makes total sense. And I'm going to combine these last two questions. This is kind of the next steps section where we got questions from our customer. So can we combine these last two? Where can customers get set up for a deeper dive into data protection, classification in Office 365? And does Varonis offer a risk assessment for Office 365? Same question. The answer is the same answer I say for both questions. So you can stick out, I guess, go to Varonis.com and there's a big button at the top, sign up for a demo. That will start an engagement with us where we will do a risk assessment. It's totally complimentary. You do it for free. A couple things to note about the risk assessments. Yeah, we can do a risk assessment specifically in 365. And we're doing a lot of those. If you've also got data on-prem, it's generally useful to do it hybrid and look at some of your data on-prem as well as 365. We generally do it in production. Doing this kind of thing in a lab doesn't really demonstrate all that much because we want to show you real risks and how we're going to fix them. We use the full version of the Varonis platform. You're not just getting some reporting. You're getting all of Varonis. And the risk assessment, this is in my head because I just had a conversation with a prospective customer about this. He's like, I think I know I'm at risk and that's not what I need to do. It's like, well, the risk assessment is, it's not just going to tell you have a problem. It's also going to show you the breadth and depth of that problem, put some metrics behind it. But we're also going to show you how we're going to solve the problem. The series of steps that we're going to go through, how the alerting works, how the remediation and investigation works. So you get much more than a series of reports that give you a risk assessment. So the answer is, you want to do it, go to Varonis.com, click on the demo button, or there's probably a risk assessment button, or you'll put a link in the description people can follow. If you're really specifically worried about 365, we'll do it there.
Absolutely.
We do ransomware assessments. We do threat detection assessments. We do GDPR assessments. We do or other compliance assessments, data risk assessments. If you're already a Varonis customer and you want to do a risk assessment in 365, typically the only step is we just want to make sure that you're upgraded, and that's free.
Right.
So if you're upgraded to the latest version, then you just kind of point us at your 365 tenant. And sometimes you might put a collector, and now I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, but a Varonis collector, which is a software-based server up in Azure, just to make the collection easier.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you already have Varonis deployed. We can do a risk assessment in 365 without a problem. I think that might have been the root of that second question. But if you don't have Varonis deployed, it takes a couple of hours to spin up. It's all software-based. So.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks so much. And I think that brings us to the end of our questions. So, Brian, thank you so much for walking through these. These were great questions we got from our customers during the Connect session. We'll put a link to that full Connect as well in the description. So if you want to take a look at the full thing and see where these questions came from, it's a great event, and you'll definitely get a lot out of it. We dive a lot more in depth into these topics. But I think that really brings us to the end. So, Brian, again, thanks so much. And thank you all for watching. We'll put links to the descriptions of all the different pieces of content websites that we referenced. And thank you for watching. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, Brian. Take care.
Thank you.